There was a time in America when nightfall meant the day was truly over. No glowing windows, no quiet hum of electricity behind the walls. When darkness arrived, families gathered closer, work slowed to a stop, and the nation rested, not by choice, but by necessity. This is the story of how Americans lived before power ever reached their homes.
Long before electricity shaped American life, the nation rose not to alarms or glowing clocks, but to light itself. Morning arrived quietly, without announcement. It entered through thin curtains, through frost-covered windows, through the open cracks of wooden shutters. In early America, the sun was not simply a source of warmth, it was the signal that the day had begun. When light appeared, people stirred. When it did not, they waited. In towns, villages, and scattered farmsteads across the United States, mornings were shaped by habit rather than precision. There was no universal hour to wake, no shared schedule enforced by machines. Time was felt, not measured. A farmer knew it was time to rise when the eastern sky softened from black to blue. A mother began her day when enough light entered the kitchen to see the stove. Children learned early on to read the day by the color of the morning sky. Sleep itself followed a different rhythm. Without artificial light to stretch the night, Americans often slept longer in winter and rose earlier in summer. Many experienced what historians later called segmented sleep, resting for several hours after sunset, waking briefly in the deep night, then sleeping again until dawn. These patterns were not written down or discussed, they were simply lived. When the sun rose, it did so over a country already prepared to meet it. In rural America, the morning began outside. Farmers stepped into fields still damp with dew, their breath visible in the cold months, their hands already accustomed to work before breakfast. Animals needed tending before people did. Cows were milked, chickens fed, horses harnessed. The land did not wait, and neither could those who depended on it. There was no pressing of snooze buttons, no negotiation with fatigue. The sun was up, and so was everyone else. Inside the home, mornings were quieter but no less demanding. Fires had to be rekindled, ashes cleaned, water fetched or pumped by hand. A woman might rise before the rest of her household simply to make the house livable for the day ahead. Heat did not arrive automatically. It had to be built, piece by piece, flame by flame. Children, too, were part of this rhythm. Before schoolhouses became common, many learned at home in the early hours, if they learned at all. Others went straight to work, helping in fields, shops, or kitchens. Childhood, in the modern sense, was shorter. The sun did not distinguish between ages. In towns and small cities, mornings unfolded with similar simplicity. Shops opened when the light was strong enough to see clearly. Clerks swept floors, merchants unlocked doors, bakers finished work they had begun hours earlier. Bread was often made before dawn so it could be sold while still warm. Streets slowly filled with movement, but not noise. Horses' hooves echoed more than voices. Conversations were brief, practical, and unhurried. There was no morning rush as we understand it today, no synchronized panic to arrive at a fixed hour. Life moved forward steadily, guided by daylight rather than deadlines. Breakfast, when it happened, was not rushed either. It was often simple: bread, porridge, leftover meat, milk. Meals were fuel, not indulgence. They prepared the body for labor, not leisure. In many households, breakfast waited until the most urgent morning tasks were done. Hunger was accepted as part of the day, not an emergency to be solved immediately. What defined these mornings most was silence. Not complete silence, but the absence of constant noise. No engines, no appliances, no electronic hum. Sounds carried farther: a distant rooster, a wagon wheel, the wind in trees. These were the signals of a waking world.
And because mornings were quiet, they were also reflective. People thought while they worked. Repetition allowed the mind to wander. Many Americans began their day with prayer or contemplation, not because it was scheduled, but because the stillness invited it. The early hours belonged as much to thought as to labor. Seasonal change shaped everything. Winter mornings arrived slowly, reluctantly. Light was weak, days short. People lingered indoors longer, conserving warmth and energy. Summer mornings, by contrast, were early and full. Light flooded the land before many were ready, pulling them from sleep whether they wished it or not. The body learned to adapt, to surrender to the sun's authority. This dependence on daylight created a shared understanding across the nation. No matter where one lived, on a frontier homestead, in a coastal town, or near a growing city, the sun connected everyone. It was the one constant in a country still forming its identity. Before railroads standardized time, before factories demanded punctuality, the sun was America's most reliable organizer. Yet this way of life was not romantic to those living it. It was simply normal. People did not wake with the sun because they preferred it. They did so because there was no alternative. Darkness limited movement. Artificial light was expensive, dangerous, and dim. To work against the sun was to fight nature itself. As the morning progressed, the pace of life increased slightly, but never sharply. Tasks unfolded one after another, guided by experience rather than urgency. There was time to adjust, to pause, to respond to the unexpected. A broken tool, a sick animal, a sudden storm, these disruptions were accepted as part of the day, not failures of planning. Looking back, it may seem that life moved more slowly then. In truth, it moved differently. Time was wide, not compressed. A morning could stretch long, filled with effort, but not pressure. There was no sense of falling behind a schedule, only of responding to what the day required. This relationship with time shaped American character in subtle ways. Patience was learned early, so was endurance. When the sun ruled the day, there was little room for hurry and even less for complaint. The natural world set the terms, and people adapted. Even those who lived in growing cities still felt this pull. Before widespread gas lighting and long before electricity, urban mornings were bound by the same limits. Offices opened later in winter. Construction paused when light faded. The city, like the countryside, woke when the sun allowed it to. Over time, this shared rhythm created a collective calm. Not happiness necessarily, but balance. Life demanded much, but it did not constantly intrude. When the sun rose, the day began. When it set, the day ended. The boundary was clear, unquestioned. It is difficult now to imagine a country waking together in this way, a nation rising not to notifications or alarms, but to light spreading across the land. A people whose mornings belonged not to machines, but to the quiet certainty that daylight had returned. This was America before power, when the sun and only the sun decided when the nation would wake.
Before electricity entered American homes, light was something that had to be earned. It did not arrive instantly at the touch of switch, nor did it fill every corner of a room. Light came slowly, carefully, and often imperfectly. It flickered, it smoked, it cast shadows that moved across walls and ceilings. In early American homes, darkness was not an absence, it was a constant presence, waiting just beyond the reach of flame. When the sun set, the house changed. Daylight retreated from windows, leaving rooms smaller and quieter. Families did not rush to fill the darkness. Instead, they accepted it. Darkness was expected, familiar, and in many ways respected. To push against it too strongly was costly and sometimes dangerous. The most common source of light was fire itself. Candles, oil lamps, and fireplaces formed the fragile boundary between visibility and night. Each had its purpose, its limitations,
and its risks. A single candle might illuminate a small circle on a table, enough to read or sew, but not enough to banish the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. Candles were not wasted lightly. Many households made their own, dipping wicks into melted tallow or beeswax, layer by layer, until the candle was thick enough to burn properly. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper and more common, but they smoked and carried a heavy smell. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but were reserved for churches or wealthier homes. Light, like many things in early America, reflected social class. Oil lamps were another option, though they required constant attention. Whale oil, camphene, and later kerosene were used to fuel lamps, each with its own dangers. Lamps had to be trimmed, cleaned, and refilled. A poorly maintained lamp could sputter or flare, sending sparks into the air. Fires were a constant fear. Entire towns could be lost to a single overturned lamp. Because of this, Americans learned to live with less light rather than more. Only the room being used was lit. Hallways remained dark. Staircases were navigated by memory. Children learned early how many steps led upstairs, how far the door was from the hearth, how to move through darkness without panic. The fireplace was both a source of heat and light, but it too had limits. Its glow was uneven, strongest closest to the hearth and fading quickly across the room. Faces near the fire were warm and visible. Faces farther away were half-lit, shaped by shadow. In winter, families gathered close, not only for warmth, but for the comfort of seeing one another clearly. Evening activities adjusted to this reality. Reading was done sparingly. Sewing and mending were often saved for daylight hours. Tasks requiring precision were avoided after sunset. The night was not meant for productivity. It was meant for rest, conversation, and quiet presence. Homes were designed in this in mind. Windows were placed to capture as much daylight as possible. Walls were often painted in lighter colors to reflect what little light was available. Furniture was arranged around the fireplace, creating a central point of warmth and visibility. The home did not fight darkness, it organized itself around it. Children experienced the night differently than adults. For them, shadows could stretch and shift, turning familiar spaces into places of imagination. Stories told by firelight took on extra weight. A creaking floorboard or a sudden gust of wind could feel louder, closer, more alive. Nighttime fears were common, but so was nighttime closeness. Families often slept in shared rooms, sometimes shared beds, both for warmth and reassurance. Bedrooms were rarely bright. A single candle might be used to prepare for sleep, then blown out carefully to avoid smoke or sparks. Once extinguished, darkness returned completely. There were no nightlights, no glowing clocks. Sleep came in silence, broken only by the sounds of the house settling, the wind outside, or the distant call of an animal. This darkness shaped how Americans slept. Many did not sleep straight through the night. They rested, woke briefly, then slept again. During this quiet middle period, some prayed, some reflected, some tended to fires or checked on animals. The darkness allowed for stillness without expectation.
Safety was always a concern. Fireplaces had to be banked properly before sleep. Candles were snuffed, not blown, to prevent sparks. Lamps were checked and rechecked. A single mistake could mean disaster. As a result, nighttime routines were careful and deliberate. Nothing was rushed. The cost of light also shaped behavior. Oil and candles required money or labor. Using them meant consuming resources that could not be replaced easily. Families learned restraint. Light was used when necessary, not for comfort or decoration. Brightness was not associated with luxury, it was associated with waste. In towns and cities, the situation was similar, though slightly more varied. Some streets were lit by lanterns, but these were few and far between. Indoors, businesses relied on the same methods as homes. Taverns glowed warmly in the evening, but even they were dim by modern standards. Shadows filled the space between tables. Conversations stayed close and quiet. Shops closed earlier than we would expect today. Without sufficient light, work simply could not continue. Darkness imposed a natural end to commerce. This limitation shaped daily schedules, encouraging people to complete tasks during daylight hours and rest when night arrived. Women bore much of the responsibility for managing light within the home. They made candles, cleaned lamps, tended fires, and taught children how to behave safely around open flames. Their work was constant, but often invisible, noticed only when something went wrong. Fireplaces themselves required care. Chimneys had to be cleaned to prevent dangerous buildup. Sparks could escape, landing on wooden floors or furniture. Hearth rugs were kept nearby, ready to smother flames if needed. Buckets of water or sand were often kept close, just in case. Despite the danger, fire was also comforting. Its movement brought life to dark rooms. It softened faces, warmed hands, and created a sense of enclosure. In the glow of firelight, families talked, told stories, and shared news of the day. These moments were unrecorded, but they formed the emotional center of home life. Silence accompanied this light. Without electric noise, the crackle of fire became prominent. The small sounds of home, breathing, shifting chairs, whispered words stood out. The night invited listening as much as seeing. Over time, Americans became deeply skilled at living this way. They learned how much light was enough. They learned how to read faces in shadow, how to move confidently through dim rooms, how to rest without stimulation. Darkness did not signal danger by default, it signaled a change of pace. Yet this way of life also limited possibility. Winter nights were long, productivity slowed, isolation could deepen. For those who lived alone or in remote areas, darkness could feel heavy and endless. Light, when it came, was welcomed not only for what it revealed, but for what it promised, a return to activity, connection, and motion. As the 19th century progressed, new lighting technologies began to appear. Gas lamps in cities, brighter oil fuels. But for many Americans, especially in rural areas, flame remained the primary source of light well into the 20th century. Electricity arrived unevenly, transforming some homes while leaving others unchanged. When switches finally replaced flames, the change was profound. Rooms grew larger. Night became usable. The boundary between day and night softened. But something else faded as well. The deep familiarity with darkness, the shared rituals of light, the quiet endings to each day. Before switches, homes were shaped by flame, by its warmth, its danger, its limits. Light was precious, darkness accepted, and night was something to move through gently. This was how Americans lived, by candle, by lamp, by fire, long before power entered their walls.
Before electricity, before time clocks and buzzing alarms, work in the United States moved at the pace of the sun. It did not begin at a precise hour, and it did not end because a bell rang. Instead, labor unfolded gradually, shaped by light, weather, and the quiet understanding of what needed to be done before darkness returned. In early American life, time was not something people chased, it was something they observed. The rising sun did not demand speed, it offered opportunity,
When there was light, there was work. When light faded, work slowed and eventually stopped. This rhythm was so deeply ingrained that few questioned it. It was simply how life functioned. For farmers, daylight was everything. Fields could not be plowed, planted, or harvested in darkness. Animals could not be safely tended at night. A cloudy day meant less work accomplished. A long summer day meant more. The sun dictated effort, not ambition. Even the hardest working farmer understood that there were limits imposed by nature itself. Morning work began gently. There was no sudden rush into labor. Tasks followed familiar sequences learned over years of repetition. Tools were gathered, animals were checked, fields were walked before they were worked. These early hours were steady and purposeful, not frantic. Work warmed the body slowly, allowing muscles to adjust and minds to settle. As the sun climbed higher, labor intensified. Midday brought the most demanding tasks, when light was strongest and visibility clearest. This was when plowing went deepest, hammering rang loudest, and long distances were covered. But even then, there was no sense of racing against a clock. Progress was measured by completion, not by minutes. Breaks were taken when the body required them. A pause to drink water, a moment to sit in shade. Rest was not scheduled, it was felt. Fatigue was not something to be ignored or pushed through endlessly. It was a signal, just as meaningful as the position of the sun. In workshops and small businesses, the same principles applied. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and shoemakers relied on daylight streaming through windows and open doors. Precision work was done when light was clear and strong. As shadows lengthened, tasks became simpler or were postponed entirely. There was no advantage to forcing work in dim conditions. Mistakes were costly, materials were precious, and injuries were difficult to treat. Shopkeepers opened when they could see their goods clearly and closed when they could not. Customers understood this. No one expected a store to stay open after dark. Commerce adjusted itself to daylight just as agriculture did. The entire economy breathed in time with the sun. Children were part of this working world. Many began contributing at a young age, not because of cruelty, but because survival required shared effort. Their work followed the same daylight rules as adults. Chores were completed in the morning and afternoon. Evening was reserved for rest, not productivity. Childhood exhaustion was expected, but so was sleep. Without artificial light, there was little incentive to overwork. Even those driven by profit or necessity could not extend the day indefinitely. Darkness arrived whether one was ready or not. This natural boundary protected people from endless labor, even as it limited output. Productivity had a ceiling, and everyone accepted it. Seasonal change altered everything. In summer, work days were long. People rose early and continued until the light was nearly gone. In winter, days were short, and work adjusted accordingly. Some tasks were saved for warmer months. Others were abandoned entirely until spring returned. The calendar was not divided by dates, but by light. This seasonal rhythm created a different relationship with effort. There were times of intense labor and times of enforced rest. Winter evenings were quieter, slower, more reflective. Work did not dominate every waking moment. The absence of light created space for stillness. Weather also shaped labor in ways that modern schedules rarely allow. Rain halted work, snow changed priorities, extreme heat slowed movement. These interruptions were not inconveniences, they were realities. Nature was not something to overcome, but something to work alongside. In towns, craftsmen adjusted their schedules with similar flexibility. A shoemaker might work long hours during certain seasons and fewer during others. A printer relied heavily on daylight to read type accurately. Errors caused by poor light were unacceptable. As a result, work quality often mattered more than speed. There was also a strong connection between work and community.
Neighbors helped neighbors during peak labor times, especially during harvests or barn raisings. These shared efforts followed daylight closely. When the sun set, work ended and social time began. The boundary was clear and respected. Women's labor followed this same rhythm, though it often remained inside the home. Cooking, cleaning, preserving food, and caring for children all depended on daylight. Tasks were planned carefully to make the most of available light. Laundry, sewing, and food preparation were often scheduled for the brightest parts of the day. Household work was never truly finished, but it was shaped by the same limitations as field work. When light faded, precision tasks stopped. Evenings were for maintenance, not creation. Mending, conversation, and quiet preparation replaced active labor. This way of working created a shared understanding of time across social classes. Whether rich or poor, rural or urban, most Americans experienced the same daily limits. Wealth might provide better tools or brighter candles, but it could not extend the sun. Everyone stopped when darkness came. There were no standardized time zones, no synchronized clocks controlling behavior. Each town lived slightly differently, rising and resting according to its own light. Time was local, personal, and flexible. Being late was less about minutes and more about missed opportunity. This flexibility reduced stress in ways difficult to measure. Without constant deadlines, people focused on tasks rather than schedules. Completion mattered more than speed. Work was judged by outcome, not efficiency. The absence of artificial urgency allowed for a steadier pace of life. Yet this system also demanded discipline. Without clocks to dictate behavior, individuals had to pay attention to light, to weather, to their own bodies. Responsibility was internal, not imposed. Those who failed to work when light allowed it faced consequences later. As industrialization approached, this daylight-based system began to feel limiting to some. Factories would soon demand longer hours, fixed schedules, and work independent of sunlight. But before that transformation, American labor remained deeply human in scale and expectation. Work began with light and ended with dark. It was framed by nature, not machinery. It allowed room for fatigue, for rest, for change. And though it was often hard and unrelenting, it rarely felt endless. This was how Americans worked before the clock took control, guided not by numbers on a dial, but by the steady movement of the sun across the sky.
Before electricity eased the weight of daily tasks, survival inside an American home depended almost entirely on human strength. Every meal, every clean surface, every warm room required effort that was continuous, physical, and unavoidable. There were no shortcuts hidden inside machines. There were only hands, time, and endurance. Cooking alone was a full-body task that shaped the entire day. Meals did not begin in the kitchen, they began hours earlier, sometimes the day before. Fire had to be built and maintained. Wood had to be chopped, carried, and stacked. Ashes from the previous day were cleared carefully so that the hearth could be rebuilt again. The stove did not wait patiently, it demanded attention from morning until night. American kitchens before electricity were places of constant motion. Heat radiated outward, especially in summer, turning cooking into a test of stamina. A woman might stand for hours near a wood-burning stove, adjusting pots, lifting heavy lids, stirring thick mixtures that resisted movement. There was no precise temperature control. Everything depended on experience, how the fire looked, how it sounded, how the heat felt on the skin. Mistakes were costly. Burned food could not be replaced easily. Ingredients were valuable, often grown or preserved by the family itself. A ruined meal meant hunger, not inconvenience. As a result, cooking required full attention. It was not something done in the background, it demanded presence. Food preparation itself was labor-intensive. Vegetables were washed by hand, often with water drawn from a well or pump. Meat was cut, cleaned, and preserved without refrigeration.
Dough was kneaded manually, sometimes for long periods until it reached the right texture. Canning, pickling, smoking, and drying were essential skills practiced season after season to ensure survival through winter months. Cleaning was no less demanding. Without running water, even the simplest task required planning. Water had to be carried into the house in buckets, each trip adding strain to the arms and back. It was used carefully, reused when possible, and never wasted. Washing dishes meant heating water first, then scrubbing by hand, then disposing of the dirty water outside. Laundry was one of the most exhausting household tasks. It was not a weekly routine, it was an all-day event. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed against washboards, boiled to remove dirt and bacteria, then wrung out by hand. Heavy, wet fabric tested strength and balance. In winter, laundry froze stiff on lines. In summer, it dried under the sun, stiff and heavy with heat. There was no escape from this work. It returned every day in different forms. Floors had to be swept and scrubbed, bedding shaken out and aired. Dust, ash, and dirt were constant companions, carried in on boots and clothing. Cleanliness was never complete, only temporarily achieved. Women carried the greatest share of this labor, though it was rarely described as work. It was considered duty, expectation, normal life. From early morning until night, physical effort filled the hours. There were moments of rest, but they were brief and often interrupted. The body learned to function while tired. Children contributed as soon as they were able. They carried water, gathered wood, watched younger siblings, and helped with food preparation. These tasks were not framed as chores in the modern sense. They were participation in survival. No one was exempt. Even simple comforts required effort. Heating a room meant tending a fire constantly. Allowing it to burn down too far meant cold, discomfort, and more work later. Cooling, in summer, meant opening windows and hoping for breeze. There were no fans to stir the air. Heat settled heavily inside homes, slowing movement and thought. Physical strain shaped posture, health, and lifespan. Backs bent early, hands hardened, joint pain was common. Rest was limited, and medical relief was minimal. The body absorbed the cost of daily living quietly, without complaint, because there was no alternative. Time was consumed differently. Tasks took as long as they took. There was no way to compress them. A meal required hours. Clean clothes required a day. Warmth required constant attention. As a result, days filled quickly, not with variety, but with repetition. Yet within this repetition there was skill. Movements became efficient through familiarity. Hands learned exactly how much pressure to apply, how to lift without strain, how to pace effort across the day. The body became an instrument shaped by necessity. Despite the effort, there was little sense of rushing. Work moved steadily, not urgently. Without machines setting the pace, people worked until tasks were done, then stopped. Fatigue was expected, but it was not framed as failure. It was simply evidence that the day had been lived fully. Evenings did not bring relief from labor, only a change in its form. After sunset, heavy tasks slowed, but preparation for the next day began. Fires were banked, food was stored, tools were cleaned and set aside, the house was arranged to meet the night safely. The absence of electricity meant that nothing disappeared when not in use. Every object required care. Every system depended on attention. Neglect showed immediate consequences: cold rooms, spoiled food, unclean spaces. This constant effort created a deep awareness of cause and effect. If something went wrong, the reason was visible. If something worked, it was because someone had worked for it. Comfort was never abstract. It was earned, maintained, and fragile. Yet there was also a quiet pride in this labor, not pride spoken aloud, but felt internally. A clean house, a warm meal, preserved food lining a cellar, these were signs of competence and care. They represented survival managed successfully. Yet the cost was real. Physical exhaustion limited leisure. There was little energy left for pursuits beyond survival. Creative time existed, but it was carved out carefully, often at the expense of rest. The body dictated limits long before the clock did.
When electricity eventually entered American homes, it did not simply add convenience, it removed weight. Tasks that once consumed hours were shortened, physical strain eased, time expanded. But before that transformation, effort filled the days completely. Cooking, cleaning, and maintaining a home required strength that was renewed each morning and spent by night. It was quiet, relentless, and rarely acknowledged. It shaped lives without ceremony. This was domestic life before power, where survival depended on motion, endurance, and the willingness to repeat the same labor day after day without relief.
When daylight finally loosened its hold on the land, American homes entered a different state of being. Evening did not arrive suddenly. It crept in gradually, carried by lengthening shadows and cooling air. The brightness that had filled rooms all day retreated inch by inch until only small islands of light remained, around a hearth, a lamp, a single candle on a table. This transition was familiar and expected. No one resisted it. Evening was not something to be filled with activity or entertainment. It was a time to slow, to settle, to gather. As the sun lowered, work naturally came to an end, not because everything was finished, but because light no longer allowed it to continue. Silence grew as darkness deepened, not absolute silence, but a quieter world. The sounds of labor faded first. Tools were set down. Animals were secured. Doors were closed gently. What remained were softer noises, the crackle of firewood, the low murmur of voices, the occasional movement of chairs across wooden floors. Without electricity, evenings were intimate by necessity. Families drew closer together, both physically and emotionally. Light did not reach far, so people sat where it did. Faces were lit from below by firelight, shadows shifting with every movement. Expressions appeared and disappeared, half seen, half imagined. Conversation in the evening carried a different weight. Words were not competing with noise. There was no background music, no constant hum. When someone spoke, others listened. Stories were told slowly, shaped by memory rather than performance. A familiar tale might be repeated dozens of times across the years, each telling slightly different, adjusted by mood and audience. These stories were rarely dramatic. They were about the day just past, the weather, the condition of crops or animals, small concerns that mattered deeply. News traveled by voice, not by speed. Information moved slowly, and so did reaction to it. There was time to think before responding. For children, evenings were moments of learning without structure. They absorbed language, values, and history simply by listening. Stories taught caution, patience, and endurance. They explained the world not through facts, but through experience. A mistake made years ago became a lesson for the present. Reading, when it happened, was done carefully. Books were valuable, and light was limited. A single reader might sit near the fire, reading aloud while others listened. Pages were turned slowly so as not to miss words hidden by shadow. This shared reading created a collective imagination, one story unfolding for many minds at once. Religion often shaped evening routines. Prayer before sleep was common, not always formal but consistent. It marked the day's end, offered gratitude, and acknowledged uncertainty. In a world without control over light, weather, or illness, reflection came naturally. As night settled fully, shadows became dominant. Corners of rooms disappeared. Hallways vanished into darkness. Homes felt smaller, more enclosed. This did not always bring fear. For many, it brought comfort. The visible world contracted, and with it, expectations. The absence of stimulation allowed the mind to rest. There were no screens demanding attention, no sudden interruptions. Thought slowed naturally. Even worries softened in the dimness. The night did not invite productivity, it invited presence. Outside, the world continued quietly. In rural areas, night sounds carried far.
Crickets, wind through trees, distant animals moving unseen. These sounds were familiar and reassuring. They marked continuity. Life did not stop at night. It simply changed tone. In towns, evenings were still subdued. A few windows glowed faintly. Taverns offered warmth and conversation, but even they were restrained by darkness. Socializing remained close-knit and limited. Public life quieted early, returning the streets to shadow. Children prepared for sleep earlier than they do today. Without artificial light, staying awake required effort. Fatigue arrived naturally, carried by the day's labor. Beds were simple. Mattresses were filled with straw or feathers. Warmth came from shared space and heavy blankets. Before sleep, there was often a final moment of stillness. Fires were checked, lamps were extinguished, the house settled into darkness deliberately, not abruptly. This ritual created a clear boundary between day and night. Once the light was gone, darkness was complete. There were no glowing objects to orient the eye. The night pressed in evenly. Movement became careful and minimal. People learned to navigate briefly by memory, then remained still. Sleep itself was different in this environment. It came without preparation, without resistance. Bodies accustomed to physical labor and natural rhythms surrendered easily. Rest was not something to be optimized, it was simply accepted. Many woke during the night, briefly, quietly. These moments were not troubling, they were part of the pattern. Some used them to think, to pray, or to check the fire. Others lay awake listening to the night. There was no pressure to sleep continuously. Time felt wide, unmeasured. This nightly stillness shaped emotional life. Without constant distraction, people became comfortable with their own thoughts. Silence was not something to escape, it was something to inhabit. Reflection occurred naturally, without guidance. Even loneliness felt different. In shared homes, presence was constant, even in silence. In solitary homes, the night was heavy, but familiar. Darkness did not feel like absence, it felt like enclosure. Over time, these evenings formed the emotional core of American domestic life. They were not recorded, not celebrated, but repeated endlessly. Day after day, year after year, the same slow return to quiet. As the 19th century progressed and artificial lighting slowly improved, these evenings began to change. Gas lamps brightened rooms, activities stretched later. But before that transformation, night retained its authority. Evenings did not belong to ambition, they belonged to rest, to story, to shadow. They offered closure, not opportunity. They reminded people that effort had limits and that stillness was not failure. In this world, darkness was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a companion, arriving faithfully each day, signaling that it was time to stop. This was how Americans ended their days before power, surrounded by silence, shaped by shadow, and held gently by the night.
In the years before midnight learned how to shine, there were towns that slept early and streets that went dark long before the stars felt tired. Evening arrived like a soft command. Shops closed their mouths, doors sighed shut. Lamps flickered awake one by one, timid as fireflies, and the town settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. People spoke of those hours as if they were a season, not a time of day. The long dusk, they called it, when the world slowed its breath and memory found room to sit down. Elmford was such a town. It lay along a narrow river that curved like a question mark, its waters reflecting the sky in thoughtful shades. At 6:30 each evening, the bakery's bell rang, not to welcome customers, but to announce the last loaf. By 7, the butcher wiped his block clean. By 8, only the post office light remained, a square of amber against the dark, as if the building itself were awake on purpose, while everything else dreamed. The streets went dark early because they were meant to. Electricity had come late to Elmford, and when it arrived, the council decided that too much light made people forget where they were. A single lamp at each corner, spaced far enough apart that the dark could still speak between them, was deemed sufficient. Children learned to navigate by silhouette and sound. Adults learned to trust the rhythm of footsteps, the soft cough from a porch, the hum of the river beyond the trees. On Maple Street stood a row of houses that shared their news through open windows. Mrs. Calder hummed as she washed dishes. Mr. Boone practiced his clarinet with the stubborn patience of a man trying to make peace with a memory. The Rivas twins argued in whispers that carried anyway. The houses were close enough to borrow warmth from one another in winter, and far enough apart to keep secrets until morning. The town slept early, but it did not sleep without dreaming. Dreams in Elmford were communal things. They rose from the river mist and settled on rooftops, slipped through chimneys and keyholes, and found their way into the minds of those who lived there. People woke with the same ideas, the same worries, the same unspoken plans. It was how the town agreed on things without meetings. It was how Elmford decided when to change. Change came on a Tuesday, as it often does, quietly and with paperwork. A letter arrived for the council from a company whose name sounded like promise, Northline Illumination. They proposed a modernization, new lights, brighter streets, longer hours. Safety, the letter said, commerce, progress. The words gleamed like polished metal. The council met at dusk. They sat around a table scarred with decades of decisions, their faces half lit by the single bulb above. Outside, the river whispered, unconcerned. Inside, the arguments unfolded politely. The younger members spoke of opportunity. The older ones spoke of tradition. Everyone spoke of money. In the end, they voted to consider it. Word spread in Elmford in the way of all important things, slowly, sideways, with embellishments. By Wednesday, the bakery's bell rang with an anxious edge. By Thursday, Mrs. Calder's humming lost its tune. On Friday, Mr. Boone played his clarinet too loud, as if daring the dark to argue back. Only Jonah seemed untroubled. He was the keeper of the lamplights, a role that existed mostly because the town liked having someone to thank. Each evening, Jonah walked the streets with a long pole and a careful pace, lighting lamps that already glowed, adjusting wicks that rarely needed it. He was tall, with a face that looked like it had been listening longer than it had been speaking. He knew the dark by name. Jonah had been born in Elmford and never felt the need to leave. He believed that towns, like people, should be understood before they were improved. When he heard about Northline Illumination, he smiled the way one does at a story told by a stranger, interested but not convinced. On the night the representatives arrived, the streets went darker than usual. Clouds gathered with intention, blotting out the moon. The lamps held their ground, small and steady. The representatives stepped from their car in shoes too polished for the pavement, their coats crisp with ambition. They spoke at the town hall, their slides glowing bright against the old walls. They showed photographs of streets bathed in light, of shops open late, of people laughing under electric suns. They promised safety, prosperity, and the end of fear. Fear, Jonah thought, had never been Elmford's problem. After the presentation, the representatives answered questions. Mrs. Calder asked about the cost. Mr. Boone asked about the noise. The Rivas twins asked whether the new lights would attract moths. The representatives smiled and assured and deflected. They spoke a language fluent in certainty. That night, Elmford dreamed restlessly. The next morning, people woke with different thoughts. Some felt excitement buzzing beneath their ribs. Others felt a quiet grief they could not explain. The river ran as it always had, but it seemed to watch more closely. Work began the following week. Trucks arrived with equipment that clanged and shone. Poles were planted.
Wires stretched like spider silk across the sky. The lamps Jonah tended were replaced, one by one, with fixtures that promised daylight at midnight. Jonah walked his route anyway. He carried his pole, though it was no longer needed. He spoke to the dark as it retreated, thanked it for its years of service. The dark listened, patient as ever. When the switch was flipped, Elmford gasped. The streets blazed, shadows fled, windows reflected themselves back at the night. People stood in doorways, stunned by the brightness. Children laughed and ran. Their games extended into hours once reserved for sleep. Shops stayed open. Conversations grew louder, longer. The town did not sleep early anymore. At first, it felt like a victory, but something subtle shifted. Dreams became private. People woke with different ideas, conflicting worries. Meetings grew longer. Decisions stalled. The river mist thinned, uncertain of its place. Mrs. Calder stopped humming. Mr. Boone put away his clarinet. The Rivas twins argued out loud. Jonah noticed that the new lights did not flicker. They did not hesitate. They did not allow for darkness to speak. He noticed how the stars faded, embarrassed by the competition. He noticed how the town's breath quickened. One evening, Jonah did not walk his route. Instead, he sat by the river and listened. The water spoke of balance, of rest, of the way things had been held together by the spaces between light. The following week, the power failed. It began with a pop, a brief stutter, and then the lights went out, all of them. The town plunged into a darkness it had not known in years. People froze, startled by the sudden quiet. Somewhere, a car alarm cried out, and then fell silent. Slowly, eyes adjusted. The old lamps, those that had been spared, flickered to life, shy but determined. The river mist returned, curious and comforting. People stepped outside. They recognized one another by voice, by posture, by memory. Conversations resumed, softer now. Laughter sounded different, less performative, more true. Jonah took up his pole and walked. The darkness did not feel like loss. It felt like return. The power was restored by morning. Northline Illumination issued apologies and promises. But something had changed again. The council met and spoke of compromise, fewer lights, warmer bulbs, curfews for brightness. Elmford did not abandon progress, it redefined it. The town learned to sleep early again, not every night, but often enough. Streets went dark when they were ready. Lamps flickered and listened. People dreamed together on purpose. Years later, visitors would comment on the quiet, on the way dusk seemed to linger, on how the dark felt welcoming rather than threatening. Jonah would smile and say, "We learned that light is a conversation." And when the streets went dark, Elmford listened.
Before electricity learned how to stretch the day, before wires stitched cities together and screens learned to glow, entertainment was something you could carry in your hands, your voice, or your memory. It did not arrive from far away. It lived where people lived. It was simple, local, and unmistakably human. In those days, evenings were shorter, but they felt fuller. The sun did not linger out of politeness. When it set, it meant it. Shadows lengthened with purpose, and people adjusted their lives accordingly. Work bent toward daylight, and rest arrived early, not as a punishment, but as a shared agreement between bodies, land, and time. In the village of Hawthorne Bend, nightfall was not the end of life, it was a change in tempo. The fields grew quiet, the river softened its voice, and people moved closer together. Doors remained open longer, windows glowed with candlelight. Stories waited patiently for their turn to be told.
Hawthorne Bend was small enough that everyone knew the sound of everyone else's footsteps, the blacksmith's heavy stride, the school teacher's careful rhythm, the children's running feet that never seemed to touch the ground. There was no need for clocks to announce the hour. The smells of supper did that work just fine. Entertainment did not have a separate building. It lived inside kitchens, on porches, in barns cleared of tools for the evening. It belonged to no one and to everyone at once. On most nights, after the dishes were cleared and the candles trimmed, families drifted outside. The air was cooler then, and the stars had begun their slow, deliberate appearance. Someone would bring a stool, someone else a fiddle, someone else nothing at all but a willingness to listen. Music was the first language of leisure. It did not require permission. Old instruments carried newer hands, and newer songs borrowed older bones. The fiddle sang of distances it had never traveled. The drum remembered every hand that had ever struck it. Voices joined in when they felt brave enough, cracked when they didn't, and were welcomed either way. There was no audience in the modern sense. Everyone present was both performer and witness. Applause came as laughter, as a foot tapping harder against the dirt, as a nod that said, yes, that part mattered. Children learned rhythm before they learned numbers. They learned harmony before they understood agreement. Sitting close to adults, they absorbed songs the way they absorbed language, without instruction, without effort, without fear of mistakes. When the music rested, stories took its place. Stories did not belong to books alone. They belonged to mouths in memory. They were shaped by repetition and softened by time. Every storyteller carried the same tale differently, like water poured into different cups. Old Mara, whose hair had turned the color of ash, was known for stories that wandered before they arrived. She began in one place and ended in another, stopping often to examine the scenery along the way. Children loved her stories because they felt endless. Adults loved them because they felt true.
There were stories of the land, how the bend in the river had once saved the village from flood, how a certain oak tree had survived lightning twice, how the hill to the east was said to hum quietly when the ground was restless. There were stories of people, of courtships that unfolded slowly, misunderstandings that lasted a lifetime, moments of courage so small they would have been missed if not spoken aloud. No one checked facts too carefully. Accuracy mattered less than meaning. A story's job was not to report, but to connect. Games followed stories, especially when the children could no longer sit still. Simple games, learned once and remembered forever. Guessing games, clapping games, contests of balance and breath. Nothing required equipment more complex than a stone, a stick, or a willing opponent. Laughter carried far in the dark. It did not compete with engines or machines. It traveled freely, stitching the village together with invisible thread. Sometimes entertainment came in the form of work made lighter by company. Corn husking bees, apple peeling gatherings, quilting circles. Hands stayed busy while minds roamed. Songs kept time. Gossip moved carefully, aware of its audience. These gatherings blurred the line between necessity and pleasure. Work was not hidden away during the day in entertainment summoned at night. They flowed into one another, inseparable. Seasonal celebrations marked the year more clearly than any calendar. Harvest festivals, midwinter feasts, spring dances held on packed earth under uncertain skies. Each season brought its own sounds, its own flavors, its own stories. During winter, entertainment moved indoors. Fireplaces became stages. Shadows on walls performed quietly while people spoke.
The crackle of burning wood provided a rhythm no musician tried to outdo. Long nights encouraged longer conversations. People spoke of things they avoided during the day. Regrets surfaced gently. Hopes were tested aloud. Silence, when it arrived, was respected. There was an intimacy to pre-electric nights that later generations would struggle to recreate. Without artificial light, faces revealed themselves slowly. Expressions were read by tone as much as by sight. Listening mattered. Not everyone was skilled, and no one expected perfection. A wrong note did not ruin a song. A forgotten line did not end a story. Entertainment was not a performance to be judged, but a moment to be shared. In Hawthorne Bend, there was a man named Elias who carved small figures from leftover wood. He never sold them. He gave them away during gatherings, placing them quietly beside someone's cup or plate. A horse, a bird, a child holding a star. No explanation offered. Receiving one felt like being seen. Entertainment also included quiet acts, reading aloud by candlelight, one person holding the book, others leaning close. The reader adjusted pace to the flame, pausing when the wick needed trimming, resuming when the light steadied. Letters were read and reread, sometimes performed with exaggerated voices, sometimes whispered with care. News traveled slowly, but it traveled together. On clear nights, people watched the sky, not passively, but attentively. They knew the stars by name and behavior. Entertainment included guessing which would appear first, which would fade last. There was room for boredom, and boredom was not feared. It was understood as a doorway. From it came invention, reflection, and rest. When storms arrived, entertainment adapted. Thunder provided drama. Rain on roofs became percussion. Fear, when it appeared, was managed collectively. Time itself felt different. Without constant stimulation, moments stretched. An hour could hold many things. An evening could feel complete. As years passed, whispers of electricity reached the village. People spoke of light that did not flicker, of sound captured and replayed, of images that moved without living bodies. Some were curious, others were cautious. They could not imagine entertainment without presence, without proximity, without the warmth of shared air. When electricity finally arrived, it arrived politely, then insistently. Lamps replaced candles, radios replaced storytellers, screens replaced the need to look at one another. Some traditions faded quietly, others held on stubbornly. But even as wires spread and nights grew brighter, something essential remained. A memory in the body, a preference in the heart. People still gathered, though less often. Music still happened, though sometimes recorded. Stories still mattered, though written down. Those who remembered life before electricity spoke of it not as a hardship, but as a different kind of wealth. Entertainment before electricity was not about escape, it was about arrival, into the moment, into the group, into oneself. It was simple because it had to be, local because it could be, human because there was no other option. And in that limitation, it found depth. Even now, when lights refuse to go out and noise fills every corner, the old forms wait patiently. A song sung without amplification, a story told without proof, a game played without prize. They wait for evenings that slow down, for towns that remember how to sleep early, for people willing to sit close enough to hear one another breathe. Because long before electricity learned to entertain us, we entertained each other. And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, we still do.
Before electricity pushed the night into retreat, before hospitals glowed like cities within cities, Health and medicine lived close to the edge of darkness. Healing was shaped not only by knowledge, but by light. How much of it existed, when it disappeared, and what people did when it was gone. In those years, darkness was not simply the absence of sight, it was a boundary, a test, and sometimes a teacher. In the river town of Greyhaven, night arrived early and without apology. The sun dipped behind the low hills, and shadows gathered quickly in the narrow streets. Windows warmed with candlelight, and the town adjusted its breathing. Illness did not wait for daylight, but treatment often did. Greyhaven had one physician, Dr. Samuel Harker, whose practice occupied 2 rooms above the apothecary. He owned no machines that hummed or blinked. His tools were modest: a leather bag worn thin at the edges, a thermometer wrapped in cloth, a stethoscope polished smooth by years of use, and hands trained to listen. Medicine, then, relied heavily on observation. Doctors learned to read the body the way sailors read the sea. Skin color, breathing patterns, posture, tone of voice, each offered clues. In daylight, these signs spoke clearly. At night, they whispered. When darkness fell, limitations appeared. Candlelight distorted color. A fevered flush could look like health. A pale face could hide its warning. Shadows exaggerated some symptoms and concealed others. Dr. Harker often carried 2 candles instead of 1, placing them carefully to reduce deception, knowing that even light could lie. Most treatments were prepared during the day. Herbs were dried in sunlight, not only for warmth but for clarity. Labels were handwritten, careful and slow. Mistakes were costly. A wrong leaf, a misread mark, and healing could turn dangerous. The people of Greyhaven understood these risks. That understanding shaped behavior. They rested earlier. They avoided unnecessary strain. Children were kept close after dusk, not out of fear, but caution. Darkness demanded respect. Women carried much of the medical knowledge within the town. Midwives, herbalists, caregivers, names rarely written down, but memories held firmly. They knew which roots calmed pain, which teas reduced fever, which poultices drew infection to the surface. Their work was intimate and exhausting. Childbirth often happened at night. Candle flames trembled with every contraction. Midwives learned to work by touch as much as sight, counting breaths, listening to cries, trusting muscle memory. Not every birth ended well. Darkness did not forgive mistakes and sometimes offered no second chance. Infections were the true enemy. A small cut could become a sentence. Without electric sterilization, cleanliness depended on discipline: boiling water, alcohol, fire. Light mattered. Being able to see dirt meant being able to remove it. When night fell, surgeries stopped unless absolutely necessary. Dr. Harker refused many operations after sunset, earning a reputation for stubbornness. But he had learned that steady hands meant little when shadows interfered. The margin for error was too thin. People adjusted expectations. Pain was endured longer. Death, when it came, was not hidden behind machines. It arrived quietly, often at night, and was witnessed by those who loved. Illness reshaped time. A sick household moved differently. Meals softened, voices lowered, entertainment disappeared. Healing required silence and patience. Sleep itself was considered medicine. Darkness enforced rest in a way advice never could. Without artificial light, the bodies surrendered naturally. Fevered patients slept deeply, their bodies working unseen. Yet darkness also carried fear. When symptoms worsened after sunset, anxiety grew. A cough sounded louder. A breath seemed shorter. Families sat awake, watching flames burn low, listening for changes they might miss. In those hours, medicine blended with faith.
Prayers filled the spaces between breaths, not as surrender, but as focus. Belief helped people endure uncertainty when vision failed. Epidemics tested the limits of darkness most brutally. When influenza reached Greyhaven one winter, it arrived silently, a cough here, a fever there. By the time the pattern was visible, daylight was no longer enough. The sick crowded into homes, candles burned through the night. Doctors and caregivers worked until exhaustion blurred judgment. Darkness hid progression, it masked deterioration until morning revealed the cost. Without electric light, night care was reactive rather than proactive. Treatment followed cries, not monitors. Survival depended on vigilance. Dr. Harker aged quickly that winter. His hair thinned, his hands shook. He learned where darkness truly limited medicine, not only in what could not be seen, but in how long humans could remain alert without rest. After the epidemic passed, the town changed, not dramatically, but permanently. People spoke differently about health. They valued prevention more. Clean water, better nutrition, spacing between homes. These were defenses against darkness. When electricity was first discussed, it was framed as progress, convenience, safety. For medicine, it was something else entirely: possibility. The first electric bulb installed above the apothecary was modest. It hummed softly. But beneath it, labels became clearer. Colors became honest. Night lost some of its authority. Soon, lamps appeared in homes. Illness no longer dictated sleep entirely. Care could continue without guessing. Midwives could see what they touched. Doctors could operate later with confidence. Electricity did not cure disease, but it widened the margin for error. It gave medicine time. Hospitals evolved. Rooms stayed bright. Instruments reflected light cleanly. Sterilization improved. Infection rates dropped. Darkness retreated from the sick room. Yet something else was lost. Continuous light disrupted rest. Patients slept poorly. Bodies confused by artificial day struggled to heal. Doctors worked longer, sometimes past wisdom. The boundary darkness once enforced, stop now, rest, wait for morning, disappeared. Health became a battle fought endlessly, rather than a rhythm balanced with surrender. Elderly residents of Greyhaven noticed this first. They missed the quiet nights, the way illness once slowed life, forcing attention inward, the way care felt communal, not clinical. Modern medicine saved lives, but it also distanced people from death. Machines replaced hands, numbers replaced listening. Still, no one wished to return fully. The limits of darkness were real. Too many lives were lost in shadow. Too much pain endured because light was insufficient. The lesson was not to reject progress, but to understand it. True health, Greyhaven learned, lived between extremes, between darkness and light, between rest and intervention, between acceptance and action. Doctors began dimming lights at night. Hospitals adjusted schedules. Sleep returned as medicine. The old midwives taught new nurses how to listen without machines, how to trust breath and posture, how to feel health, not just measure it. Electricity expanded medicine's reach, but wisdom determined how far it should go. Even now, when the town sleeps beneath glowing windows, darkness still holds a role. It reminds bodies when to slow. It reminds minds when to let go. Health is not the absence of darkness, but the ability to move through it safely. Medicine is not only light, but knowing when light is enough. And in the quiet hours, when lamps dim and machines rest, the old truth returns. Healing, at its deepest level, is human. It listens, it waits, and sometimes it learns best at the edge of the dark.
Change rarely arrives with thunder. More often, it begins as a flicker, brief, uncertain, easily dismissed, a small light in a darkened room,
a new sound where silence once ruled, a feeling that something has shifted, even if no one yet knows its name. This is how change first came to the valley, quietly challenging the habits of a lifetime. Before that moment, the world moved according to rhythms older than memory. Days were shaped by the sun, nights by fire and shadow. People woke when light allowed and rested when darkness insisted. Time was not counted precisely, it was felt. A task took as long as it took. An evening ended when the flame grew tired. The town of Brackenford lay nestled between low hills and a slow-moving river. It was not isolated, but it was unhurried. Roads passed through it rather than toward it. Travelers remembered it for its quiet streets and early nights, for the way lanterns appeared like stars fallen to earth. In Brackenford, progress had always arrived cautiously. New tools were tested, discussed, and only then adopted. The past was not rejected, it was consulted. The first flicker of change appeared on a late autumn evening. It came not as a declaration, but as a curiosity. At the far edge of town stood the old mill, long retired from grinding grain, but still used for storage. On that evening, a faint glow appeared behind its windows after sunset, steady, pale, and unfamiliar. It did not dance like flame, it did not breathe with the wind. People noticed. At first, they assumed it was a trick of reflection. Someone mentioned moonlight, someone else blamed glass, but the glow persisted, unmoving, indifferent to explanation. Children were the first to approach. They always were. They crept close, their shadows stretching ahead of them, and pressed their faces to the glass. Inside, wires snaked across the walls. A small bulb hung from the ceiling, glowing like a captured thought. By morning, the town was talking. The glow belonged to Thomas Reed, a man who had left Brackenford years earlier and returned changed. He had traveled farther than most, worked in cities that never truly slept, and learned skills that did not yet have names in the valley. He spoke of currents in circuits, of energy that moved unseen. Few understood him completely. Enough understood to be uneasy. Thomas requested permission to demonstrate his invention at the next town gathering. The council agreed, though cautiously. Curiosity had already taken hold. That evening, people gathered earlier than usual. Lanterns lined the square. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and expectation. Thomas stood beside a wooden crate, his hands steady despite the murmurs. He explained slowly, choosing words carefully. He spoke of harnessing motion, of converting effort into light. He promised nothing beyond what he could show. Then he turned a switch. The bulb ignited. There was no smoke, no spark, just light, clean, unwavering, almost polite. The crowd inhaled as one. Some gasped, some laughed, some crossed themselves. The light revealed faces differently. Wrinkles sharpened, eyes reflected brightness not born of fire. Shadows retreated to corners, confused. The demonstration lasted only minutes. Thomas switched the bulb off, unwilling to overwhelm. The square fell back into familiar darkness, but it did not feel the same. People went home quietly. That night, Brackenford dreamed uneasily. In the days that followed, opinions formed. Shopkeepers imagined longer hours, seamstresses imagined finer work, doctors imagined clearer vision, parents imagined safety. Others imagined loss. They spoke of stars fading, of nights losing meaning, of rest forgotten. The old lantern lighter, Elias Moore, listened more than he spoke. He had spent decades tending flame, understanding its moods. He knew light was never neutral. It always asked something in return. The council debated for weeks. Thomas answered questions patiently. He acknowledged risks. He admitted limits. His honesty unsettled those who expected salesmanship. Eventually,
Permission was granted for one streetlight, a trial, nothing more. The chosen street ran past the post office and the apothecary, practical, central, symbolic. When the light was installed, the town gathered again. At dusk, Elias lit the lanterns as usual. Then Thomas threw the switch. The electric lamp bloomed. It outshone the others without effort. It did not flicker or fade. It simply was. Children played longer. Adults lingered. Conversations stretched. The night did not end when it should. At first, this felt like a gift, but change never travels alone. Sleep patterns shifted, mornings felt heavier, the quiet hours shrank. Elias noticed moths circling the new light, confused by its constancy. He noticed fewer stars. Still, progress continued. More lights followed. Homes requested wiring. The mill became a workshop. Brackenford grew brighter and louder. Machines extended work. Entertainment expanded. Silence retreated. Yet even as the town changed, resistance remained, not loud, but persistent. A group continued meeting by candlelight. Stories were still told. Songs were still sung without amplification. Thomas himself began attending these gatherings. He listened. He learned. He realized then that the flicker he had introduced was not only technological, it was cultural. The challenge was not light versus dark, but balance. After years of adjustment, Brackenford found its rhythm again. Lights dimmed after certain hours, lanterns returned to side streets. Darkness was invited back, intentionally. The first flicker of change had grown into something steadier. Not a blaze, not an erasure, but a coexistence. Generations later, people would speak of that first light with reverence, not because it was perfect, but because it taught them something essential. That change does not ask permission, but it does require wisdom. That progress without memory is reckless, and that even the smallest flicker can reshape the night. The valley still sleeps under stars, and sometimes, when the lamps dim, people swear they can see the future flicker, softly, carefully, within the dark.
There was never a single night when darkness surrendered completely. It did not fall in battle or vanish in a flash. Instead, it retreated slowly, step by step, corner by corner, until one day people realized that it no longer ruled their lives the way it once had. Darkness still existed, but it had lost its power. For centuries, darkness had been an authority. It decided when work must stop, when doors should close, when bodies should rest. It shaped fear and comfort alike. In villages and towns across the world, darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was a condition of life. In the town of Larkspur Hollow, darkness had once been absolute. Larkspur Hollow lay between forest and field, far from major roads. Sunset arrived early there, swallowed quickly by tall trees and low clouds. When night came, it came fully. Homes glowed faintly with candles and oil lamps, each flame a fragile defense against the vast black surrounding it. People planned their lives around this certainty. Meals were early, conversations were intimate, silence had weight. Darkness demanded humility. Children were taught to respect the night, not to fear it unnecessarily, but to understand it. Injuries happened more often after sunset. Illness felt heavier. Travel was dangerous. Darkness did not forgive carelessness. Medicine slowed at night. Work paused. Entertainment softened into stories, songs, and prayer. Rest was not optional. It was survival. This was the world before darkness began to lose its grip. The first signs were subtle. A new kind of lamp appeared in the general store, brighter, steadier, less dependent on oil quality. Then came rumors from neighboring towns. Streets lit past dusk, shops staying open, doctors operating later, factories working into the night. At first, these stories felt distant,
Larkspur Hollow had heard promises before. Progress often arrived late and left early. But then the wires came. They arrived on wagons pulled by tired horses, coiled like metal vines. Workers followed, speaking a language filled with numbers and confidence. Poles were planted, lines were stretched. The town watched from porches and doorways, uncertain what exactly was being invited in. When the first electric lights were installed, they were placed carefully, one at the crossroads, one near the clinic, one outside the schoolhouse. Not everywhere, not yet. On the night they were switched on, people gathered. The darkness pulled back. The light did not flicker or bow to the wind. It stood its ground. Shadows shrank. Faces were revealed clearly, without the soft forgiveness of flame. Some people smiled, others felt exposed. From that night forward, time began to change. Work extended. Shops experimented with later hours. Students studied longer. Letters were written at night. The boundary between day and night blurred. Darkness no longer decided, humans did. At the clinic, Dr. Eliza Moore noticed the change immediately. Night visits became safer. Wounds could be cleaned properly. Fever could be monitored without guessing. Lives were saved simply because light allowed accuracy. For the first time, medicine pushed back against the night instead of yielding to it. In homes, families adjusted. Children resisted sleep. Parents struggled to enforce rhythms once dictated by nature. Rest became a choice, not a command. Darkness had lost one of its oldest powers, authority over time. But it still held fear. Outside the reach of the lamps, the forest remained black. Paths beyond town were treacherous. Night sounds still unsettled the unprepared. Darkness retreated, but it did not disappear. Years passed, more lights followed, generators improved, power stabilized. Then came the machines. Radios filled the silence, factories hummed, entertainment arrived from far away. Voices of strangers replaced local storytellers. Music no longer required presence. Darkness lost another power, control over attention. People no longer had to sit with their thoughts. Silence became uncomfortable. Light and sound filled every gap. Elder residents noticed the difference first. They spoke of nights that once felt deeper, of conversations that lasted longer because there was nothing else to compete with them. Younger generations adapted easily. They grew up without knowing darkness as a ruler. To them, it was merely an inconvenience. Yet darkness resisted in quiet ways. Sleep disorders increased. Bodies confused by endless light struggled to rest. Anxiety grew. Fatigue became common. Doctors began to prescribe darkness. Curtains were drawn, lights dimmed, screens were turned off. Slowly, medicine acknowledged what progress had overlooked. Darkness still had a role. The moment darkness finally lost its power was not when the lights arrived, but when humans learned they could turn them off. This realization came during the Great Outage. A storm unlike any before struck the region. Wind tore down lines, rain flooded stations, electricity failed across towns and cities. For 3 nights, darkness returned. At first, panic followed. People reached for switches that did nothing. Silence felt unfamiliar. Fear resurfaced. Then, memory returned. Candles were found. Stories resurfaced. Neighbors gathered. Children slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Doctors worked by flame and experience. People rested when night insisted. Darkness was no longer feared, but it was no longer obeyed blindly. When power returned, something had changed. People used light differently, more intentionally. Night modes appeared. Curfews returned, not imposed, but chosen. Darkness no longer ruled, but it was no longer exiled. In Larkspur Hollow, they began turning off the streetlights after midnight. Stars returned. Quiet returned. Darkness had lost its power not because it was defeated, but because it was understood. It became a partner, a signal to slow down, a reminder to rest,
a space where healing could still happen. When darkness finally lost its power, humanity did not become brighter, it became wiser. And under that balance of chosen light and welcomed dark, life continued, no longer ruled by night, but no longer running from it either.